They didn't send one person, they sent the swarm. Not physically, but psychologically. A chorus of subtle attacks masked as advice. Smirks instead of support. Repetition instead of reasoning. They arrived with charm and suggestion, feigned concern and rehearsed compliments, each one carefully crafted to dilute your power while pretending to cheer you on. And you felt it, not as a sudden blow, but a slow erosion, a fatigue you couldn't name at first, because the attack wasn't loud, it was ambient. Background noise turned toxic, but you adapted, not by fighting fire with fire, but by becoming wildfire. They couldn't cage what they couldn't calculate. And what they feared most was that your silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. You didn't crumble. You transformed. Their attempts to overwhelm you became the very training ground that refined you. They threw shade to block your light, not realizing you had long stopped relying on external suns. They tried to drain your energy by flooding you with doubt, but doubt has no leverage over someone who no longer seeks permission to exist. They had a plan to stabilize you quietly, make you question your momentum, swarm you with opinions, comparisons, and narratives that would make your path seem uncertain. But your conviction wasn't rented, it was rooted. So when the pressure built, so did your depth. While they moved in numbers, you moved in purpose. That difference shattered their strategy. They underestimated your endurance because they only knew how to win short term. They mastered the art of fast appearances. You mastered the art of lasting presence. You didn't respond to every tactic. You observed. You didn't retaliate. You recalibrated. While they were trying to go viral, you were going vital. Building something so internal, so foundational, that no public storm could shake it. And in the stillness they mistook for weakness, you were sharpening, watching, designing your next move with precision they'd never developed. Because they were built on tactics, you were built on truth. They tried to surround you with noise to drown your name, but all they did was amplify it. Every attempt to discredit you turned into a spotlight they couldn't shut off. You weren't obsessed with being liked. You were obsessed with being real. And in a world where most people trade truth for applause, that made you a problem. You became legendary not by climbing over others, but by refusing to collapse under their projections. They couldn't explain your rise because it didn't fit their framework. You weren't selected. You weren't crowned. You emerged. That's what made it undeniable. Legends aren't made from ease. They're born in resistance. The more they tested you, the more you discovered who you were. You learned that some people attack, not because they see your flaws, but because they see your freedom. You weren't controllable. You weren't waiting for validation. And when someone's influence can't shape your core, they send reinforcements. Not because you're wrong, but because you're unshakable. That's the part they could never mimic. They tried to mimic your tone, your style, your essence, but they couldn't duplicate your peace. Because yours wasn't manufactured, it was earned. You didn't rise by accident. You were forged in contradiction, celebrated in whispers, doubted in meetings, tolerated in rooms where they prayed for your fall. But you walked through it all with the composure of someone who had already survived worse. They thought sending the squad would break you, but they forgot resistance sharpens clarity. Criticism, when met with stability, becomes confirmation. You didn't fight back on their terms. You rewrote the battlefield. You weren't trying to outplay them. You were playing a different game, one where the prize wasn't clout, it was control over your own soul. They sent numbers. You sent energy, singular, focused, devastating energy. You made each interaction count, every word deliberate, every exit surgical. You weren't reactionary. You were surgical with your absence. While they plotted, you purified. While they spoke, you built. And by the time they realized your silence wasn't compliance, you had already shifted the entire atmosphere. Legends don't announce their arrival. They become the silence that makes others question their volume. Your story didn't go viral. It went internal. It made people reflect. You weren't flashy. You were undeniable. There's a difference. One fades after applause. The other lingers in silence, shaping rooms long after you leave. They tried to exhaust you with attention, but you transmuted it into power. You used every jab as a data point, every rejection as a compass, every alliance against you as proof you were never supposed to be part of the herd. That's what made you legendary. Not popularity, not sympathy, but resilience. The kind that makes even your critics nod in respect when no one's watching. You didn't fight for a crown. You walked as if it was already yours. That's what shook them. You didn't ask for a stage. You turned your daily life into one. And every time they thought they had cornered you, you revealed a door they didn't know existed. Your legend wasn't born in victory. It was born in how you handled everything they threw at you without losing your grip on yourself. They came in waves. You stayed rooted. They came in squads. You came in silence. They came to break you. You turned into the myth they now whisper about, hoping you don't show up again. You became a symbol, a disruption, a psychological shift they couldn't contain. And in trying to silence you, they made sure everyone paid attention. You never needed to scream. You just needed to keep walking. Each step louder than their entire noise parade. They thought overwhelming you would delete your impact. Instead, they documented your rise. That's the irony. They spent all their energy trying to break you, only to make you unforgettable. Now your name tastes different in their mouth, part regret, part reverence, because when the smoke cleared, the squad was gone. But your name remained, carved, not in trend but in time. They relied on your performance to feel powerful, not your truth, your performance. The version of you that laughed on cue, softened your voice, adjusted your tone, and mirrored their insecurity with just enough praise to keep them inflated. They mistook your emotional labor for affection, never realizing it was survival. You performed to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, to be likable in a room where truth would have made them squirm. They needed that version of you. They fed off it, because the moment you stopped performing, stopped smiling past discomfort, stopped making their ego your responsibility, the illusion collapsed. And so did their sense of power. They were never powerful on their own. They were powerful in your compliance. You didn't realize it at first. You thought you were being kind, thought you were being patient. But every time you laughed at something that cut, every time you agreed just to keep things smooth, every time you swallowed truth so they could feel comfortable, you were performing. For their ego, for their safety, for their fantasy, you weren't expressing. You were managing. And when you finally stopped, when your face held still during their self-important story, when your tone stayed flat in the face of their manipulation, they felt it. The vacuum, the absence of control, the unraveling. They had nothing left to stand on once your performance ended. They wanted an audience, not an equal. That's what made it all so fragile. You weren't allowed to have your own emotions unless they aligned with theirs. You weren't allowed to feel anger unless it was convenient for their narrative. And the more you tried to remain agreeable, the more they mistook your restraint for weakness. They needed you to stay predictable, to keep hitting the same emotional notes like a background track to their superiority. But one day you broke rhythm. You stopped responding on cue. You stopped apologizing for your tone. You let the silence stretch. And they panicked. Because the real you wasn't someone they could dominate. The real you wasn't invested in the performance anymore. They crafted entire personas around being the one who always knew better, who had the final word, who could correct you, mold you, educate you, under the guise of care, of connection, of guidance. But really, they were extracting, siphoning validation from your compliance. And the moment you started responding with neutrality instead of praise, with clarity instead of confusion, their mask began to slip. You saw the panic behind the smile, the disorientation behind the lecture. They lost their footing because their power was never self-sourced. It was built on how well you danced around their needs. There's a particular kind of fury that surfaces in someone who loses control of the person they thought they owned emotionally, not owned through force, but through expectation, through the belief that your role was to never outgrow them, never contradict them, never threaten their narrative by evolving. But you did. You outgrew their blueprint. You detached. You stopped shrinking your truth to protect their comfort, and they couldn't take it. Because for them, your identity was always supposed to orbit theirs. Your growth became an act of defiance. Your silence became rebellion. Your presence, once pleasing, became powerful. And to someone who relied on your performance, that was the ultimate betrayal. They still replay moments, wondering when the shift happened, when their charm stopped working, when their subtle digs stopped landing, when your eyes stopped seeking approval. They don't understand that it wasn't a moment. It was a slow erosion. You got tired of pretending, tired of managing their moods like they were glass and you were the cushion, tired of sacrificing your voice so they could feel heard. So you stopped. You turned inward. You started choosing clarity over comfort. And that small, sacred shift destroyed their illusion of dominance. Because they weren't powerful, they were just enabled. You're dangerous now because you no longer need applause. You no longer measure your worth by how smoothly you fit into someone else's script. They relied on the version of you that would rewrite herself mid, seen just to preserve their spotlight. But this version of you, this version lets them sit in their own silence, lets them feel the absence of flattery, lets them experience the discomfort of not being the center. You've stopped rehearsing lines that make others feel safe in their delusions. Now you speak when you want to. Now you leave when it costs you peace. That autonomy, that unapologetic presence, is the death of their illusion. They used to know what to expect from you, and that gave them confidence, controlfort. But now you walk into a room and they're unsure if you'll nod or call it out, unsure if you'll stay or walk away. That unpredictability isn't recklessness. It's liberation. It's the result of no longer being held hostage by performance. You've stopped bending. You've stopped dressing up your thoughts in lace and diplomacy. Now you speak in clean lines. Now you live without the need to be digestible. And they feel that shift like an earthquake under their feet. You're no longer accessible through guilt. No longer reachable through obligation. They can't summon the old version of you with a nostalgic story or a fabricated crisis. That script no longer works. Because your healing isn't performative either. It's private, quiet, permanent, and the more you protect it, the more threatened they become. Not because you're dangerous in the traditional sense, but because you no longer serve the narrative they depended on to feel whole. You've become the disruption, the unscripted presence, the reminder that performance ends, and the truth always walks out last. They relied on your performance because it shielded them from accountability. But now, with every boundary you set, with every emotion you no longer fake, you force them to meet themselves. And most people don't want that. They want comfort, not clarity. They want control, not connection. But you no longer perform. You embody, you observe, you choose. And in doing so, you become the villain in their story, not because you did wrong, but because you stopped playing a role that was never meant to last. You were once an open book left on a crowded table, spine broken, pages worn, highlights bleeding through every sentence, as if begging someone to care enough to finish the story. You mistook vulnerability for invitation. You didn't just share your wounds. You explained them, justified them, annotated them. Because you thought if they understood the pain, maybe they wouldn't repeat it. But some people don't come to understand, they come to consume. They flip to the tragic chapters like voyeurs at a wreckage, nodding along as if empathy could substitute for effort. And each time you explained, they took notes. Not to get closer, but to better mask their exits next time. They grew addicted to your self-dissection. The way you wrapped chaos in eloquence. You didn't cry. You curated metaphors. You didn't scream. You composed quiet paragraphs. And in doing so, you became easy to sit beside, even while bleeding. They liked that version of you. The version that bled beautifully. The version that translated betrayal into insight. You made it easy for them to be harmful without feeling like villains. They counted on your gift to humanize what should have been disqualifying. And you, in your desire to be understood, let them walk away feeling profound, not guilty. Your mistake wasn't feeling deeply. It was assuming that depth earned you reciprocity. That if you revealed the blueprint of your heart, They'd build a shelter instead of a blueprint for manipulation. You made your spirit legible. You decoded your own trauma, so no one had to work for intimacy. And still, they left. Or worse, stayed just long enough to memorize the rhythm of your healing and mimic support until it served them to disappear. They were never reading to learn. They were scanning to locate soft spots. Not partners, predators. And now you know the difference. The shift wasn't loud. There was no announcement. You simply stopped offering subtitles. You stopped translating your sighs into small talk. You stopped clarifying your boundaries as if they were negotiable. You stopped performing resilience to be digestible. Now you say less, and they feel more. You leave them in silence, not because you're cruel, but because you're no longer desperate to be decrypted. If your essence feels like a riddle, let it stay unsolved. You've earned your complexity. You've buried too many versions of yourself, trying to simplify for people unwilling to evolve. They say you changed, but what they mean is you stopped over-explaining. You stopped softening truth until it could be swallowed by those who only loved the idea of you. You stopped clearing your feelings like emotional customs officers, afraid they wouldn't pass inspection. You started withholding, not out of spite, but out of respect for yourself, for your peace, for the earned right to not translate your depth into Instagram captions, for people who never stayed long enough to understand the unfiltered version. They aren't just confused by your silence, they're destabilized by it. Because silence used to mean guilt for you. It used to mean suppression. It used to mean you were biting your tongue to keep the room peaceful. But now your silence is strategy. It's a doorframe. You wait to see who walks in with care, not curiosity. And the ones who expected you to always circle back, always clarify, always forgive by monologue, now they stand in confusion, facing the reflection of their own laziness. Because you don't do reruns anymore. The old episodes are gone. Syndication canceled. Growth demanded new scripts. You don't need them to get it anymore. You don't lose sleep over being misread, because you realize the people who refuse to understand you aren't confused. They're committed to comfort, and understanding you would mean confronting themselves, their ego, their behavior, their negligence, and very few people are ready to look into a mirror that talks back. So you stopped being the mirror. You became the locked door. And if they don't have the key, they don't get access. Not even to the lobby. Especially not to the parts of you that used to bend for bare minimum. This new version of you does not decode. It does not beg to be seen. It lets people watch or walk, but never both. You no longer volunteer emotional context for every move you make. You no longer write long texts defending your absence. You no longer let people rent your energy through confusion. And when they say you've become cold, distant, unavailable, you smile. Because you know what they're really saying. They're saying you've stopped performing, that your worth is no longer measured by your willingness to contort, that the show is over, and they were never invited backstage anyway. So now your life is invitation only, and the invite doesn't come with directions. They'll have to want to learn, to read without skipping pages, to sit with your silence without demanding a soliloquy, and most won't. Most will wander, wondering why you no longer sing your pain like a lullaby, wondering why the access expired, why the door that used to creak open with a whisper now stays shut, sealed by self-respect. And you won't explain, because being misunderstood by someone who refuses to evolve is no longer a wound, it's a filter. And that clarity, that's freedom.